Good afternoon. I'm Shannon Green. I'm the Director of the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to our institution this afternoon for a really important conversation on the state of press freedom around the world. 2017 was a record year, and not in a good way, for the number of journalists who were attacked throughout the world. The attacks against journalists and media personnel range from disparaging statements, of which I'm sure you have all seen or heard some of them, physical assaults, unwarranted detention, and sometimes even murder, with the intention of silencing those independent voices that seek to hold the government accountable. However, the challenges, as we'll discuss today, to press freedom go far beyond just the physical attacks against journalists. This year, press freedom declined to its lowest point in 13 years, amid moves by authoritarian and democratic states to control the media and the free flow of information. So we're very delighted to have with us today two guests that can help us unpack these issues, understand where things stand in terms of press freedom, and where we're all going, and hopefully to help us develop some response strategies. So first, we have Courtney Radish, who is a journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate with more than 13 years of experience in the United States and the Middle East. She joined the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, in 2014 after working with UN bodies and non-governmental organizations on free expression issues. She's also worked for numerous media outlets in the Middle East and writes and speaks frequently about the intersection of media, technology, and human rights. And then alongside Courtney, we have Ricardo Gonzalez, who came here from Mexico just to join us for this and for another training that we're doing simultaneously. Ricardo is the head of protection at Article 19, an organization that focuses on the freedom to speak and the freedom to know. Article 19 promotes best practices for promoting these rights and protecting these rights and freedoms on the ground, while enhancing the international instruments that protect them. Ricardo has been with Article 19 since 2006 and has held a series of positions in which she's accumulated more and more experience and responsibility. And today's event will be moderated by my colleague Lana Bidas, who is a senior fellow with the Human Rights Initiative at CSIS. Prior to joining our program, she worked as both an academic and a practitioner in the fields of human rights, gender equality, development, and international humanitarian law, holding posts with the United Nations, Crisis Action, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the American University in Cairo. So clearly a very talented and capable group of people to talk through these issues with you, and I would like to now welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Where do you want us? I will sit in the middle, so that's easier. Thank you, Shannon, for this introduction, and welcome everyone to today's event. I have the privilege to moderate this conversation with our distinguished speakers. Courtney and Ricardo will share with us their insights on the state of press freedom here in the United States and around the world. As Shannon mentioned, 2016 and 2017 witnessed a deterioration in state of press freedom in democracies and authoritarian regimes. Journalists are subjected to all forms of violation by state and non-state actors with the aim to silence dissent and critical voices. Cases of harassment, intimidation, stigmatization, smear campaign, or worse, detention, life imprisonment, death penalty charges, target killings were reported almost daily and in every part of the world. Journalists were targeted and murdered for their opinions, investigative reporting and covering corruption cases, blogs, tweets, and Facebook posting. Despite their dire situations, journalists and reporters continue presenting reliable, critical, independent, and quality reporting. As we begin 2018, it's a good time to have this conversation and take stock of 2017 and discuss what more can be done to protect press freedom, a fundamental freedom for a functioning democracy. Just before we begin our program, I would like to have a quick note on our program. I will have a conversation with our speakers for about 40 minutes or so, and then I will open the floor for our audience to engage with our speakers. The event is streamed online and on the record. Without further ado, I want to start with you, Courtney. The turn of the century has been marked by steady gains in press freedom in various parts of the world. The general momentum of the 1990s and 2000 was toward greater freedom, less censorship, and expanded influence for independent media around the world. Is this euphoria, in your opinion, a distant memory, and why?
So I would say the euphoria I really felt, having been in this field for a while, both as a journalist and a press freedom advocate, and I wrote my dissertation book about Egypt, was in 2011 and 2012, when what came to be called the Arab Spring not only spread throughout the Middle East, but we saw around the world that there were these movements, and we saw that the technology platforms that were out there really facilitated the free flow of information, not without barriers certainly, but there were these opportunities, and journalists and activists and bloggers were able to use these innovative methods to organize, to disseminate information, to produce information. And in many cases, there was a gap between what the governments were able to do in that space and what those independent voices were able to do in that space. And so I was very excited in 2011, 2012, going to Egypt and Libya and seeing this opening. And I will say that I don't think I've ever felt it being so bad for press freedom globally than I do this year. And that's for a variety of factors. I think because you've seen since 2011, with the ongoing conflict in Iraq as well as the conflict in Syria, you saw a huge rise in the number of journalists killed. And while we've seen that taper off in the last 2 years, it's still quite high, with 44 journalists murdered last year. And that's in both crossfire as well as murder. We've also seen the past 2 years historic highs of journalists who are jailed for their work. So 262 journalists, as you see up here on the infographic, were jailed for their work last year. The year before was another record year. And so, what we're seeing is not only is there repression in the physical space, but we're also seeing that extend into the online realm. And so that space that kind of used to exist for a lot of this, I think what that was responsible for a lot of the euphoria is no longer, because the governments have been able to really put into place more legislation to restrict that space. They've oftentimes clamped down even harder on online speech. And meanwhile, we have a dominance of a few key platforms in that space. That means, according to a certain company's terms of service and according to their algorithm, what is allowed to be shown or not has a huge impact on the type of news that can be seen. So, in the past, Syrian citizen journalists were getting their news out from Syria. Now we're hearing reports that YouTube is taking off thousands of videos of the Syrian conflict. We're hearing that Facebook is censoring content coming from the crisis in Myanmar. So across the board, I would say that euphoria is pretty much tempered out.
And just to follow up on this, in terms of on what grounds, for example, these platforms are removing and censoring?
So there are a couple of factors. One, there is the effort to counter violent extremism. Second, there is the effort to counter fake news, which encompasses quite a few things, and more generally issues around hate speech and harassment. And so what we see happening is, as pressure continues to mount for the platforms to do more to counter violent extremism and prevent the spread of fake news on their websites, including in some cases legislation like in Germany, where the new NetzDG law can impose fines of up to 50 million euros for failing to remove clearly illegal content within 24 hours or 48 hours. The problem is that that's not a judicial decision. There is no judiciary telling them what is legal or illegal. So, what happens is we're seeing a lot of content being removed. If you're facing fines, if you're facing political pressure as a company, and we've heard this from company representatives on the record say, we are going to over-censor content. And so we see that in Myanmar, in Syria, in these conflict zones, but also in places like India, we've seen reports that those on a certain political spectrum are being censored. We've heard reports from the United States where very right-wing news outlets as well as left-wing news outlets like the Worldwide Socialist website as well as the Daily Stormer have had their traffic impacted by algorithms. They've been kicked off services like web hosting services. So there's kind of an array of different types of responses, but it really, I would say, is being driven by the effort to counter violent extremism online and now the fake news issue.
Thank you. And Ricardo, do you share Courtney's perspective on this?
No, definitely. I think that past years, what we have seen is actually the result of many other patterns of violence, and I think this is really important. I think that what is happening to free expression and press freedom around the world is we need to frame it within other types of conflicts. And this is really important to understand that sometimes it's, the harassment against critical voices, the harassment against free press and independent press is actually a result of a larger conflict. And we can talk about it later, but I also think that what we've seen during the last years is also some sort of a backslash of the democratization wave of the 80s. Now that a lot of countries in Latin America and in Africa have been able to, impose a democratic system, what we're seeing now is a backslash of that kind of improvement during the last years. And I think that, yes, the issue of big data, algorithm, it is a problem, but also it is a problem that we need to frame within a larger problem, which is the shrinking space of the shrinking pattern of civic space in many countries, the absolute resistance in some societies, for example, to be open and diverse, for example, and open the possibility of expression for women, for example. I think that's also a problem in which what we're seeing is it's a result of the battleground that it's been created online and offline against the voices that are bringing some sort of a democratic perspective into the discussions. And I think that's we need to stop and understand that. And also, I think that by doing that, we need to understand that there has been also some improvement in so many countries. I mean, we have the proliferation of laws for access to information in so many countries, which I think is a really important step forward. By passing the law, we're not solving the problem, but at least we're moving into the correct direction. I think that's also a thing that we need to also take on account. But it's not sufficient, and in so many regions and so many countries, we're actually moving backwards.
And on that, and your Article 19 issue recently, the expression agenda metric,
yeah.
And in that, you highlighted the backsliding, but the improvement. Mm-hmm. In general, where you see how these improvements been taken, like we will see any improvement and any change in opening civic space in the coming year?
Well, I think that countries like Tunisia, for example, they have moved forward with this, within this Arab Spring scenario. They're actually, even with so many challenges, they've been able to steadily but move forward. And I think that that's one country that we need to take a look at. For example, Colombia, that it's finally overcoming 50 years of armed conflict. And now, I mean, the numbers of killed journalists is coming down, which is a good thing. But as Courtney said, I mean, Yes, the number of killed journalists is really important, but that's not the worst thing that can happen to an independent journalist. I mean, for example, even in countries where defamation it's a civil law process, you know, the fact that journalists have to spend huge amounts of money to defend themselves, I mean, that's actually a situation where journalists are actually, you know, willing to go to jail for 6 months and just move forward instead of paying, you know, these huge amounts of legal fees. And I think that we need to understand that free press and freedom of expression at large needs an ecosystem that works. And that's not only about the law, but also an enabling environment in so many other ways, which includes, you know, a strong media that are cognizant about the needs of their employers, which is also an issue. We need to have a society that it's also aware of the importance of having a press that is free and independent. And I think that part, it's also important. It's not only about the law, but rather a set of elements that needs to be in place.
Thank you. Courtney, with your experience, you've been in the field for over 13 years as a journalist, researcher, and advocate for freedom of expression. How do you see year 2017?
So I think that we're seeing in 2017 a broader geopolitical shift that's underway as the United States, in many sense, is abdicating its role as a world leader. And certainly we can see this in the field of human rights, and particularly on press freedom. And we put out some awards the other day called Press Oppressors Awards, and we did that as a tongue-in-cheek response to President Trump's tweet announcing that he would be giving out awards for the most dishonest media and fake news journalists. And you know, that's not usually our style, but we wanted to make sure that any coverage of this ridiculous idea that the President of the United States would give such awards to the media were actually contextualized, and so that we could understand how damaging that rhetoric really is. It's true, in the US we don't have journalists who are imprisoned for their work and routinely murdered for their work. There have been arrests of journalists, and we remain deeply concerned about, you know, felony charges against journalists covering protests and the like. But you know, they're not facing the same dire threats that they are around the world, but it is a more dangerous environment. We've been tracking this year on the US Press Freedom Tracker since January 1st, last year, 2018, last year, January 1st through, and we will continue for the next, you know, few years to track the number of incidents in the US. So we're seeing that that journalists are under pressure in the US, but the reason we're concerned globally is because we can't depend, as we have under previous administrations from both parties, on the US to be a voice supporting human rights in the international community and supporting press freedom. So we've seen the withdrawal of the United States from UNESCO, which is the UN agency mandated to protect and promote freedom of expression and routinely speaks out on journalists who are killed for their work. Now, having worked inside there are a lot of issues with UNESCO, and there was a previous era where the US withdrew. No administration is perfect. We had major problems with Obama, for example, and President Obama subpoenaing journalists and using the Espionage Act and the mass surveillance program. I mean, lots of problems. But on the international stage, President Obama, President Bush with his democracy agenda, supported human rights. They brought them up in their international and bilateral relationships. They pressured governments, and we saw the impact that had around the world. Because in Ethiopia, before President Obama did a trip there, we were able to get some Zone 9 journalists, Zone 9 bloggers out of prison there because that was on the agenda before this presidential trip. We know many times, we would say, hey, this, Deputy Assistant Secretary or this, Secretary of State is going to this country, whether it's in Asia or Latin America. Hey, can you raise these cases? Can you meet with journalists? Can you give local journalists an opportunity to ask you questions and set a good example? Could you visit these journalists who are in jail? And trust me, they didn't always take our advice. I believe there was a trip to Turkey where they didn't even raise jailed journalists, but many times they did. And they were willing to hear us out and consider that. That's not the case anymore. There's no Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Rights at the State Department, which means we have no interlocutor. You don't have campaigns being done by the US to free journalists the way that you have in the past. And there just isn't that moral authority anymore. So when you have the President of the United States, tweeting out and saying negative things about the media, not just negative things, but pillorying, vilifying the media, using fake news as an epithet to not only attack individual journalists and media outlets, but also to attack the very fundamentals of journalism and the journalism as a pillar of democracy, I think is very problematic. And so what I see for 2017 and looking ahead at 2018 is this idea that there is no truth, that journalism doesn't really mean anything different than propaganda. And I think that is incredibly detrimental, but it's very useful for people in power, not just political power, economic power, any power, where the press is that independent perspective on power. They are the ones who hold those in power accountable by making more transparent what's going on, whether we're talking about covering, the school board meetings or covering boardroom meetings and everything in between. And so I think that as we see, the United States stepping back from that role, and we have not yet seen Europe stepping up, and in fact, Europe's whole approach to how they think technology firms should deal with what I was talking about earlier is deeply problematic. We saw a murder in Malta of a journalist who was covering corruption in a Western European country, EU member. I think it's a scary situation because it's not something where I've worked as a free expression advocate, press freedom advocate. I have not worked under these conditions before, so it is something new that we're trying to figure out how to work.
And how do you see these setbacks about here in the US and other democratic countries being normalized and used by authoritarian leaders around the world?
Oh, there's so many ways. So we saw in Cambodia, for example, that this idea of restricting access and the news media being fake news and pointing to the example of the media not being allowed into certain White House briefings, being used as an excuse to kick out Radio Free Asia and Voice of America from Cambodia. We saw in Poland this idea of the fake news media, as Poland is sadly following the lead of Hungary, which has become a very really backslid a lot on press freedom and is becoming much more repressive for media. We've seen obviously Putin use this terminology. We've seen China. There were some great tweets put out by the official Chinese media, and I think it was the Foreign Affairs Ministry, that said, hey, see, we told you fake news is a problem. We've been saying this for years, right? And you're like, no, that's not the message that we were trying to get across, right? I mean, China is routinely at the top of the list of jailers of journalists. It's number 2 this year, 40 journalists behind bars, many of them not even charged with anything, but oftentimes, because of they were reporting on something that the government didn't want them to report on. And that's not just corruption or human rights, it's even, environmental issues or, corporate issues. So I don't know where we're going to go from here because, where is the international will to improve press freedom environment?
And Ricardo, let me turn to you. And how's this anti-press rhetoric been seen in Mexico and Latin America and other parts of the world that you're covering?
Yes, well, I think that I was speaking with some colleagues from Latin America when the rise of this terminology just came about, and we laugh a little bit, out of fear, maybe.
Very little bit.
maybe out of fear, but it's like fake news, we call it business as usual. I mean, this is not a new trend. I mean, it has been present in so many countries. And I think that if we need to characterize the last year, 2017, with one word or one concept. I mean, I would say there is an agnosis, which is in literature, is when the main character becomes aware of something, whether it's the main fabric of his own character, some relationship or something, but that's the concrete moment when they realize. And I think that for freedom of expression and free press organizations and advocates, it has been a moment that we realize that censorship is actually an intrinsic temptation for any kind of government, whether they're from the left, from the right, centrist, or whatever. I mean, I think that's something that we need to realize. There's no guarantee that a government will not walk into that path, and I think that's something that we're seeing here, for example, right? Now, this rhetoric, anti-press rhetoric, I mean, we can actually see the results of that kind of rhetoric, as Courtney mentioned, in Russia, for example, but even in Venezuela, with Chavez. Chavez, when he arrived to power, democratically elected, he pushed forward this kind of rhetoric, and at some point, it was really easy to do whatever he wanted. And if you want to compare the rhetoric from President Trump and President Chavez, at his time when he was in power, I mean, we can see a lot of similarities in terms of, a total disregard for the separation of powers, a total disregard for the public's right to know, the stigmatization of critical voices. I mean, this is really, for us in Latin America, it's actually not a new path. It's actually something that we have seen before, and we know what are going to be the results. And this is, I mean, I understand that within the First Amendment legal framework, it's really difficult to establish, the link between an expression and a violent act. It needs to be direct and clearly linked, right? But we cannot deny the fact that that speech always have some sort of concrete results. And when you have someone in power speaking in those terms, it's actually an invitation for their own political base, for their followers, to actually do something about it. And I think this is why this should be a cause of concern in those terms, because this is something that we can foresee in the next year. Something that it might not come directly from the government, but the political base that are constantly bumped with this kind of ideas can actually do something about it. I mean, when you see in a political rally someone having a bumper sticker or a message saying "kill the press" or "hang a journalist," that's actually something that should be taken on account with great concern. Words have a concrete result, and especially when are expressed from someone into power.
And we saw actually Maduro just held his own fake news awards.
Yeah.
So we've seen, we can see a direct impact between what's happening here and what's happening around the world.
Yes.
And even if it, I think, happened, even if those were the conditions already, now it's somehow legitimized, right? And they don't have to worry about the pushback from the U.S. that they may have experienced previously.
And Ricardo raised this important point about really mobilizing the people against the press, and this is where it comes. You've seen a couple of events happening, particularly in India, where you see journalists being killed by a nationalist. So, and that's how you deal. Let me start with Courtney. How you deal with this aspect?
I mean, it's incredibly challenging because what this rhetoric does is it undermines people's faith and belief in journalism. When I was in Egypt a couple of years ago on a press freedom mission there to meet with the authorities who are jailing journalists and equating journalism with terrorism, we heard from reporters in Cairo that they weren't comfortable not even going out with a camera, but even with a pen and paper, because the public was so anti-press that they would get attacked. And that's what we have to be concerned about when we have so much anti-press rhetoric and when it's so politically divisive, is people becoming violent. I think that as press freedom organizations, that's very challenging because we traditionally know how to do advocacy with governments when there's a specific interlocutor. But with general publics, it's about sentiment. But I think there has been a recognition that in many cases, people don't really understand what goes into the journalistic process. Mm-hmm. They might not understand, sometimes people equate the media with the punditry, which is, I think, different, and don't necessarily think about how much of what they know and what they need to know as citizens, as consumers, comes from the media. And that when we're talking about journalists, we're talking about that local reporter, which are sadly diminishing, but that local reporter in covering the local state house or covering the school board meetings. How do you know what's happening? How did you know that there was a salmonella outbreak on from what was it, Chipotle or whatever? It was because journalists let us know, and then we can make educated choices. So I think sometimes there's this distance between people who think of journalists and this very politicized, the media over here. And one of the challenges, I think, is to help people really think about what journalism means, what journalists do, and why that matters to them as individuals and their right to know. Because ultimately, of course, we care about journalists and what is happening to them, but it's also because when a journalist is killed or attacked or harassed, it has broader implications, not just for that person as an individual, but on the broader public, on their right to know. When you have a African-American female journalist who is harassed for her reporting on the campaign so badly that she then withdraws from being a reporter, you've lost that perspective. Right? So this has broad implications and ripple effects for the public. I don't think I have a good, answer about what to do about it.
No, but you did in terms, Ricardo as well. It's just like how to counter this rhetoric and how to deal with this sentiment in the ground.
Yeah, I think that I just want to go back, if I may, a little bit about who is actually undertaking, carrying out this kind of attacks against a journalist. And I think that the issue of non-state actors always arises. And it's really easy to say, okay, it's not the government, it's somebody else. It's either organized crimes, groups, it's either gangs, it's either political activist groups, or even some sort of a civil actor doing these kind of things. But we need to realize that these groups will always need some sort of support from the state. So, if we're saying, for example, organized crimes groups are killing journalists in Mexico, that doesn't excuse the government in any way. And this is the same in Bangladesh, for example, the killing of bloggers. Yes, it's not the government, but the government is actually inciting indirectly this kind of sentiment. And I think we need to understand that part. Also, the issue of self-censorship, I think it's also important to understand that this kind of rhetoric also promotes self-censorship. And it's really difficult to measure or to understand the extent of this kind of sentiment, because even when I speak with journalists, they will always say, oh no, I publish everything because I will not hold back, in this kind of heroic stand. But in reality, for example, in places where the political control of the press is so strong, they don't need to attack anyone physically. We have seen, for example, the decrease of killed journalists in Russia for quite some time, almost 7 years. But that doesn't translate into a better situation for anyone. Now, coming back to this, is like, I think we need to realize that the society as a whole needs to become a player in defending free expression. And this is about promoting tolerance, about promoting the understanding of the need of having, a free, vibrant press. I think that's, we need to bring society into the equation, because if we only interact with the government, pretty much it's like a train just going straight ahead and just destroying everything on its path. Finally, there's also a thing that I think we need to take on account. There is, at the moment, at least at the rhetorical level, a consensus for the protection of journalists. I mean, we have seen that there is at the moment a strong legal framework at the global level to protect journalists. We have 3 different resolutions from the UN, a progressive stance at the Inter-American level, and at the African system as well. We need to use that kind of consensus and bring it to the national level. Because I mean, it's really interesting to see that actually, governments that are actually killing and imprisoning journalists are actually part of this kind of consensus. Just recently, Turkey, Mexico were part of this, groundbreaking resolution at the UN. They actually went as far as to understand the implications of privacy protection, the protection of sources for journalists. And even they also mentioned the issue of gender-based attacks against journalists. I know that it is at the global level, but we need to bring that into the national level, no matter what are the countries. Because I think that, and here's the beauty of the legal framework at the international level. It can work in any single country. All countries have a space for improving this. So especially in the U.S., we need to promote the openness for international scrutiny.
I would just like to pick up on this point because it's important. I found this debate and its internal dilemma, personal dilemma. It's just like we have this beautiful legal framework, and it's the ideal. But when it's come to implementation and to bring government to fulfill their obligation, and this is where we come into a deadlock. And on that, I don't have the answer, but it's just like in terms, what can be done given that, as you mentioned earlier, it's a closed civic space, we don't have in some countries independent judicial system. So how can we bring this ideal?
There's also one thing that we need to take into account also, that there are a lot of things happening beside the government and the press relationships, and this is something that we need to learn and process in terms of knowledge. For example, in Pakistan, in so many countries where things are really bad for the press is actually organizing and creating their own safety mechanisms. They are collaborating. For example, the Panama Papers. I mean, this is a clear example in where the media just put aside the competition, the economic competition, and they come together to work in a more collaborative environment, not only to share the cost of some of these investigations, but actually to share the risk of these investigations. And I think we also need to take a look at how this safety environment is being created in so many countries, and how can we nourish these kind of organizations that are trying to counteract this kind of rhetorics. And I think that it's not only about the media, but also with other kind of groups. I mean, there are groups that are organizing as well. And how can we bring this kind of knowledge to other countries at the same time?
But on your question, I think that I'm of two minds in terms of how do you bring this nice international framework down into the national level. I mean, on the one hand, in most countries, it is illegal to murder people, including journalists. Yeah, exactly. So it's really not the lack of a legal framework; it's the lack of political will. So as you've seen, for most of the history since we've been tracking the killings of journalists, the majority of them are murdered, and 9 out of 10 murders go unsolved, or rather, the perpetrator is never brought to justice. So there is rampant near 100% impunity for most murders. And so that is about a lack of political will. Yeah. And that is why, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, not having the United States or other, powerful actors, whether that's because they have aid relationships or, strong bilateral ties or whatever, not having them pressuring in that international relationship to do something about it is problematic. You know, the Maguindanao massacre in the Philippines that killed 34 journalists in 2009 remains unsolved. And I don't think that we expect, you know, President Trump to be pressuring President Duterte, right? Rather, they're hanging out and, you know, they're buddy-buddy. President Trump met with the top 3 jailer of journalists, you know, among his first state visits. So, you know, on the one hand, in some cases like journalist murders, we don't lack the legal framework. But my other mind is, yes, it matters to have these legal frameworks because they provide that norm. They are attempting to create a norm. They are providing leverage that local actors can use in their own domestic advocacy, and that can have an impact. You know, when we write letters to world leaders, you know, we'll often reference what type of international commitments they've made. You know, were they a signatory or even a co-sponsor of one of those journalist safety resolutions? You know, so that can be, it can be an important tool for those on the ground.
Do you think that's, for example, the international protection mechanism that will be filling the space in terms of protection of journalism and journalists and freedom of expression?
I think, you know, I hear mechanisms a lot, and certainly having been a former UN person, worked a lot on mechanisms. You know, of course there are good examples, but ultimately a lot of this is about shifting the environment so that it is unacceptable to attack journalists, so that it is unacceptable that murders of journalists go unsolved. And so, you know, I think in some cases mechanisms can be helpful, and I think Ricardo knows a lot more about, you know, Colombia and Mexico, but I know that they also have a lot of issues with them. So, you know, I think that you need multiple solutions, and a mechanism is part of the equation, but it's not going to be sufficient by itself.
And Ricardo, if you can shed the light on Mexico and Colombia experience on dealing with this mechanism.
Yes, of course. I think that's, I agree with Courtney. It has become some sort of like a buzzword. Oh, every single country needs a protection mechanism, which is true to some extent, I have to say, because you need to have a way into, you know, for internal remedies. And I think that even if we have a really bad, you know, a scenario here in the U.S., one thing that I really appreciate is the fact that they have a strong institution, and institutions, and they need to be put into work. Every single time that there is an attack or you know, something like that happens, needs to be, you know, brought to the attention of the proper authorities. And I think just before I talk about what you say about what you asked me about Colombia and Mexico, you know, the fact that the United States did not present a delegation during the last round of hearings of the Inter-American Commission around specifically about the issue of freedom of expression should be something to be pursued by civil society and the proper, you know, groups that are concerned about it. It should be, you know, building up a case. It's not going to save everything, you know, by just moving into that way, but at least something needs to be done in that way. Now, about Mexico and Colombia, due to the fact that they have weak institutions, widespread impunity, there was a need to create a special mechanism where journalists at risk could be, you know, protected. In some cases, they actually have provided guards, safe haven, you know, so many things that are, you know, in place in those countries. But and here's the thing, you know, Mexico is actually the country that has spent more money and have, you know, a wide range of institutions specialized, allegedly, to protect journalists, but they're not working. But every time they you know, any kind of civil organization or even an intergovernmental body ask or try to hold accountable the Mexican government, they will give this large list of laws that they have passed. They have a special prosecutor office. They have a protection mechanism in place. They have a special program within the National Commission of Human Rights. I mean, they have all sorts of institutions, but they're not working. And then we'll go back to the issue of political will. I think that's, but we need, I think that the main way to decide whether there is a need for a special mechanism is civil society and in general the press needs to be testing these kind of institutions, need to be testing every single time to have zero tolerance to any kind of situations, because if we wait for the perfect case, we wait for the perfect, when things are really bad, that might be really late to actually do something about it. And I think that we need to exercise that right. Just to finalize this idea about protection mechanisms, I think that at this point, every single country should look into the possibility of whether they need or they don't a special mechanism. And because it's really important to have this kind of internal remedies ready in case it's needed. Because once a journalist has been killed, that may be too late to do something about it.
So against this backdrop and these challenges and these threats, what has been done so far to respond to all these threats and challenges? Let me start with you, Courtney.
So we talked a bit at the international level. So the UN has passed several resolutions on safety of journalists, and now I think it is firmly established that safety of journalists is an international issue, and we are building a consensus that something needs to be done. Of course, there's a long way to go until there's actual leads to implementation on the ground. But I think that is, that's an important norm to have set. Just like with the democracy promotion agenda, right? We saw democracy is the norm now. Whether that's really implemented in a democratic way, we know, okay, everyone, you even see authoritarian leaders using the terminology of democracy because it's become a norm. So I think the action at the international level and this consensus that we need to do something is important. But I don't know that I don't think that we're doing enough on the ground. What I do see that's hopeful is some civil society initiatives, such as a Culture of Safety Alliance, which was started by a group including CPJ and Reuters and several other news organizations that now include signatories, including all of the wire services and many major international news outlets, to recognize that news organizations have a moral responsibility towards the freelancers that they hire. And so you can't just take take responsibility for your staff, but you also have to think about the freelancers. And similarly, freelancers, before they go into conflict zones and for frankly really anywhere, should be thinking about their safety and security, and be able to have that conversation between the freelancer and their editor. This grew out of the violence in Syria. Obviously, everyone knows about the beheadings, and Syria was a black hole for journalists, with so many being killed that at some point, many of the Western news media outlets stopped, or any foreign news outlets stopped sending reporters there. So then they were relying on freelancers, but then freelancers were also getting killed, and in many cases, they're local journalists. And so at some point, AFP, Agence France Presse, for example, decided they're not going to take any unsolicited content from freelancers. So this led to this culture of safety, this idea that we need to inculcate a culture of safety in the newsrooms and among freelance journalists and all journalists across 3 dimensions, so physical, digital, and psychosocial. And so that means, thinking about physical safety, thinking, what equipment do you need? How are you going to get around? How much money do you need? Like, how much money do you need to make on this article or this photograph or whatever in order to be able to pay for the proper safety? How much do you need? What kind of insurance do you have? And so it's great because we've worked with ACOS. We're in the process of getting insurance for freelancers, HEFAT training, which is training before you go into a conflict zone. So that sort of stuff is very, I think, very hopeful. I think we've also seen more attention being paid to digital security, and for journalists realizing that digital security actually can't be separated from physical security, and that you have a responsibility to your sources and your colleagues and everyone else that you work with to take proper digital security precautions so that you're not not just putting yourself at risk, but putting others at risk. So I think those are positive developments. And we've also seen more focus being given to the psychosocial trauma that journalists face, especially those working in conflict zones or local journalists who can't leave because they're there. So, you know, I think that's positive. But at the policy level, you know, from what I see more restrictive laws coming out to govern online speech, often more harsh penalties being imposed for online speech. I see cybercrime laws that ostensibly are, aiming to deal with, online, organized crime or other, types of crime being used to actually stave off legitimate speech and restrict independent reporting. So, I think it's a very challenging situation that we're in because on the one hand, you want policies that protect, press freedom and protect independent reporting, but you're also having governments that are trying to figure out legitimately how to, prevent the flow of terrorist fighters or how to combat propaganda and misinformation campaigns online. So it's a very difficult position right now. And in many countries, you still have defamation, which is criminalized. Although there was a great precedent set in Africa where their human rights court determined that that is not allowed according to human rights. So we've seen, I think Ricardo mentioned earlier, we have definitely seen an international consensus towards access to information laws, not necessarily implementation, but at least the laws, which is a first step. And we're seeing, I think, also this international consensus, in some other arenas as well. But there's, always a gap between the actual existence of a law and its implementation. So, I think a lot remains to be done.
Okay. And on Article 19, you are very much involved in the legal reform in different countries. What has been done in terms, as Courtney mentioned, about the adoption of these kind of laws that's very restrictive, what you've done?
Yeah, I think that during the last 10 years we have seen this passing of laws that are allegedly addressing legitimate issues, as Courtney mentioned. And this is why it's kind of difficult to really monitor all these kind of laws, because see, they're anti-terror, cybercrime, anti-child abuse, which is also an issue. So those, many of these means of illegitimate control of the press comes in disguise. So it's really difficult to pinpoint this kind of issues. And I mean, during the last 10 years, we have been really active in engaging with government and explaining them, the many dangers of going into that way. Now, I mean, if you see the number of journalists that are either in prison or are subjected to any kind of judicial harassment, I mean, they never, well, in many cases, they never been charged of some sort of like a breach of freedom of expression, of the limits of freedom of expression. They rather, it is because they are dealing with, anti-terror issues, or they are, that's a problem with this kind of laws. Now, I mean, that's one part. The other part that we're also engaging quite actively, it's providing support to national lawyers that are actually, into court, providing the, information about legal standards, so on and so forth. But the problem with this is that it takes so much time, for actually, I mean, as I said, journalists that are facing this kind of draconian charges. It takes so much time and in so many cases so much money to actually do something about it. And I think that's also another issue about the legal elements, is that there is a widespread impunity in cases of attacks against journalists. I mean, this is a thing across the regions. And I think that by having impunity prevailing, it's actually an indirect invitation for further attacks. I mean, there is a really crude saying in Mexico, but I mean, it is true. You may end up in jail if you rob into in a convenience store or something like that, but you will never step a foot in prison if you kill a journalist. And this is true in so many countries. And this is a problem. Now also, I think we need to also understand who are the people that are in the forefront of this battle against censorship. We used to see, especially if we see everything from the global level, that we want to see these courageous investigative reporters doing, really long-lasting investigations. But if you take a look at the profile of the people that are being killed, are people that are working for small media in remote areas. And sometimes they get killed not for doing these heroic investigations, but rather just by naming someone, by just putting the finger into an issue. And this is something that we need to understand because it is part also of the inequality that prevails also in terms of labor conditions. I mean, last year, it was in July, I went to the funeral of a killed journalist in Mexico. And it broke my heart. It was really difficult to see that the editor just walked into the funeral, talked to the widow, and say, hey, by the way, we owe him money for the last two articles that he published. They give him $5. $5 for reporting on an issue that it was a widespread corruption in his community, and it was only $5. So when we talk about the importance of bringing also the large media into this equation, they also need to raise the standards of protection of their staff, and also helping small media to bring, to create these capacities of protection, because it is a major problem. There is this huge alliance at the moment in terms of protection of freelancers, for example. But in reality, almost 90%, I would say 80% of journalists do not have the proper legal and labor conditions to carry out their work. And this is something that is really problematic. And it's, I mean, if you're a woman in some countries, that will be even worse. Why? Because I will say, okay, you're working here, but it's more like a hobby because your husband is taking care of you. I mean, this just happened in Bangladesh. There was a closure of a big magazine, and they internally decided not to pay the corresponding liquidation to women because they will not need it. It was easy to pay the male journalist because female journalists were taken care of by their husbands. I mean, just imagine this kind of inequality, which also adds to the vulnerability situation that they're facing. Finally, we need to be creative. I mean, I've been documenting the killing of journalists for almost 10 years, and I refuse just to quit or just to give into the despair. We need to create more complex and more creative ways to protect journalists. Sometimes it's going to be about protesting in the streets. Sometimes it's going to be about bringing governments into accountability. Sometimes it's going to be about training editors and owners, even owners. We need to create a multidimensional, multi-layer solutions to this, and it's not going to be a silver bullet that is going to fix everything. That's not going to happen. We need to be creative about it.
And on that point, and with this uplifting mood, after this whole grim picture of the situation, what's your policy advice for the decision makers here in the US and abroad?
I mean, at this point, an acknowledges, as I said, we're in a point where we just realize the dangers of freedom of expression within the US. But the good news is that there is a plethora of standards that are already out there in international level. And I think that in terms of policy, we need to bring these legal standards that are already up there to bring it into practice here. I know that there is a long tradition of First Amendment, which is like great in terms of, it has been great for quite some time, but now needs to be strengthened. It's not only about saying whatever we want. We need to understand that now it's also, we're facing the fact that an expression can also create a toxic environment. And that was one thing that we never thought about it before. So I think that bringing this kind of legal standards, pushing for the engagement of the special mandates on freedom of expression, both at the international level and at the regional level, to bring them, to start engaging with this, with the government. And finally, it's also about, I think, it's testing what the internal remedies that are already been in place. In case they need to be reformed, strengthened, we need to challenge in court sometimes, and it's okay, I think, but we need to make sure that what is already available needs to be available, what is already available at the international level needs to be available at the national level. And taking on account that the people that are really, really under fire at this moment, as in any other place of the world, is the small local media that are actually producing and gathering the information.
Thank you very much. Courtney, what's your advice?
So one thing is pay attention to FISA reform, if we're talking about the US. So, you know, we have the First Amendment. It is quite strong. You know, we've seen threats about opening up libel laws, and I've seen some reporting today that's concerning that I want to look into more with my colleagues about around the book and the reporting there. But we do have strong legal protections in this country, so we need to make sure that those remain. But we need to look at the extra legal ways that we undermine the First Amendment, and so that includes things like surveillance. And so we need to think about, you know, I've just heard that there are more protest laws being proposed in various US states. I think the International Center for Nonprofit Law is doing a review of protest laws. I'd like to know, you know, how are journalists protected under those protest laws? Because protests have been very dangerous for journalists in the US. We have 32 arrests of journalists. Most of them have been related to covering protests. There was a journalist facing felony charges for covering a protest during inauguration. So we need to make sure that we're not skirting the First Amendment with other types of laws, or with, you know, things like surveillance, whether that's mass surveillance or targeted surveillance. And I think we need to think a lot about the type of technology and access that we're giving our government, and you know, what sort of protections we have, because it is becoming more and more difficult as a journalist to guarantee your source that you can protect them and protect their identity if they need to be anonymous. But we know that we need to have the right to protect confidential sources in order to get a lot of the information that we need as citizens and as the public. So I would highlight those as specific policy issues in the US, just because I think FISA reform is on the agenda as we speak, and looking at, you know, how do we protect the rights of journalists, you know, the right access, I think, is another issue. How do we ensure that journalists have access to public officials and to the experts in agencies? And this is not something that is just an issue under this administration. It was bad under Obama. It was slightly less bad under Bush. So we just kind of see it getting worse and worse under each administration, this attempt to funnel journalism through public information officers or restrict access, taking information that used to be public and taking it out of the public sphere, not responding to FOIA requests in the required amount of time, the issue of overclassification of data, of information, of governmental information, which is much of it is the right of the public to have, because, hey, our taxes paid for it to be produced. So I think we need to look at these issues because they are things that we can manage, and those have an impact on the environment, because guess what? You have a lot of approbation over the use of anonymous sources. Well, if you allowed people to speak to, say, EPA experts or the scientists who work in the National Park Service or whatever, then they wouldn't need to be anonymous if they had the right to speak with reporters. So then we'd have less anonymous sources. If we didn't have massive overclassification of data, then we wouldn't have so many leaks that we would then have to go after. So, these things are all related. So those are some of the things that I would highlight.
So that's great. Now I think oh my God. Okay, so I will open now the floor for question and answer, and my colleague will provide you with the mic. Please indicate your name, affiliation, and the question. Keep it precise to a question, and indicate the speaker that you want to speak to. Please.
Hi, Jennifer Watley with World Learning. Courtney, you started out your presentation mentioning the real balance that governments are wrestling with about how to counter hate speech and violent extremism while allowing freedom of expression. And you also mentioned the inordinate role that groups like Facebook and YouTube have. One thing that you didn't talk about, though, is what advice you would have to the leadership at Facebook and YouTube and Twitter if they were in this room right now.
So I think that it's important that these companies provide transparency into both their processes, but as well as their terms of service and what they mean by terminology. So, if Facebook says that it prohibits terrorist content on its site, well, whose definition of terrorism are you using? Are you using a US definition? Microsoft, I think, is the only one who's been very precise about that to say we're going to use the UN resolution and has identified that. So transparency, accountability, they need to ensure that there are ways that they are being held accountable. So if they want to self-regulate, we need to see more robust systems of self-regulation. So this could include providing lists of content that is removed that could then be subject to independent audit. So if they're saying, well, we removed all of these sites, well, let's see the list of sites, because trust me, every time I try to get them on the record about what they're doing on a particular site or a list of sites, they don't provide that. So let's open up some of this information to independent review and audit. The idea of an algorithmic ombudsperson, for example, is something that I've proposed and others have as well, to look into what are the assumptions going into these algorithms and what are the results being spit out and what are the implications of that. What are the implications for, news media and other things on the fringes? What are the impact for non-Western language news media, et cetera? And the third thing would be remedy. So make sure that you provide effective remedy for those who are impacted by the decisions of these companies to remove their content or censor their accounts, that they have an effective remedy, because what they currently have, which are these automated reporting systems, are not effective. I've talked to hundreds of journalists and activists over my career. Not a single one has ever been able to effectively use an automated system to get their account back or get their content back. It's always about using individual connections. And I literally have 2 emails I have to send, one to YouTube, one to Twitter, about journalists and a media outlet who have had their content removed or their account shut down, and they don't know why. So that's what I would suggest to the companies. And there are initiatives like the Global Network Initiative, which we are part of and a founding member, which where the companies that are part of that have agreed to go through a human rights assessment. So that's one mechanism, but they need to do more. And I also would just add to that is, you hear governments calling on private companies to do more, but they're kind of leaving it up to them what that's going to be. So I think we need to have these principles of transparency, accountability, and remedy at the heart of how we ask those companies to self-regulate.
Let's have 3 questions at a time, and then we'll answer. We have here, and here.
Hello, I'm Rosie Berman. I'm coming from the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I think both of you can address this question. How can people who care about free expression best combat disinformation in a way that does not infringe on rights to free expression? Thank you.
My name is Dr. Uchenna Eko. I'm the president of Center for Media and Peace Initiatives in New York. I have one question for Courtney and Ricardo. Looking at this figure, really, it's scary. 260 journalists, and today, last year was the worst year, so to speak. And he also spoke about perhaps the impact of the Trump rhetoric. Do you see any correlation, or is it just a coincidence that the moral authority like America is supposed to project around the world seem not to be there, and a president perhaps who regrets that we don't have strong libel laws in this country? Does that encourage other countries to say, okay, if the United States is doing stuff like this, I can as well do the same thing, you know? So I wanted to react to that. And at the same time also, Ricardo, I agree with you that a lot of times, even small media outfits that should be more impactful, you know, being socially relevant to society, you know, don't have the necessary things to really do their job. Every news organization wants to capture the center of power. And this has actually made most journalists and even the media isolated them from ordinary people. And a case in point was even last year, in 2016. How come all the media outfits could not project that Trump was going to win? That tells you that somehow we have really left the ordinary people from participating in democratic processes. We seem to be hobnobbing with the powerful, the rich, the corporate media. So, of course, if Trump says that the media is the problem and all that, he's likely going to, some people believe him. In fact, I've spoken to some of his supporters who think that the media doesn't allow him to do his job. And I asked them, how is the media stopping him from doing his job? And there's an evidence where he represents the truth, and he's caught, and he's pointed, you know, this thing is reported. So that's the job of the reporter, right? Now, his reporter say, his reporter say, no, that's not, it's the media. So yeah, it's a kind of a quandary. So you don't know what to do. So he has really muddied the environment in such a way that it's difficult to understand what is truth. So I want you to react to these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman here, please.
Thank you. I'm in front, so where do I stand? I just come over here, I guess. All right, I'm Andre Sopajo, and I'm the partner director for Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and Washington, D.C. for the Interstate Traveler Company. Now, my question is this. Great, I really enjoyed this. I mean, scary as it is. Anyway, my question is, and it actually takes off a little bit from your last comments, sir, and that is, to what extent does the ability of the United States press, the American press, get ability to counter this right wing in general for years, but now more recently the Trump administration's attack on the freedom of the press? And so my question is, what extent is this ability of the American press theoretically attenuated by the fact of the corporate media, which is that the right wing has invented this myth very successfully of a so-called liberal media. Wish it were true, but it's not. It's with honorable exceptions that we have. But the myth of and then the corporate media part comes in, and it saw so clearly during the election campaign of 2016 with CNN in particular greatly enhancing the propaganda of candidate Trump because I believe it was just good it brought a lot of viewers. That's good for advertising. So that's the heart of my question is, it's just scary.
Thank you very much. So we have, actually it's interrelated questions about how to combat misinformation and the disconnect between the media and the local population and how to counter this anti-press sentiment.
So I think in response to your question, there are a few key things. You could pay for your news, and that will then support quality journalism because then they can pay reporters to go do journalism. You can think about what platforms you read your news on and how you read that so that, are you, say, reading it on a native site or are you reading it on a social media platform, and then what does that do to the advertising revenue for that news source? I think also one of the most embarrassing things I ever did on social media was inadvertently share a fake news story. It was a satirical, the original fake news, a satirical news site. I didn't know it wasn't The Onion, so I didn't know it was a satirical news site, and it sounded so plausible. But that's what you want, is you want people to feel really, really embarrassed if they share something like that, because I think that's what we want. We want the norm to be that you would never be a decent person and share this blatantly false information. So I think those are some ideas. In terms of, I think some of the issues you identified with corporate media, it's really, if you look, you have to look at the economic incentives in a particular platform, whether we're talking about broadcast, print, or online, and what that means about the type of news you get. Obviously, we're focused on issues around protection of journalists, but there are people, for example, manufacturing consent, which looked at corporate media and I think could be extended to look at online media and what that means for today. We have to realize, individuals have choice. They have choice about what news they consume, about, how they consume the media. And so I think we need to be more thoughtful about that and realize that we're not just dupes sitting back and being duped, and to be more conscious and thoughtful about that.
Okay, thank you. Well, regarding how to address the issue of misinformation, I think that one point that it's really needed is also media literacy. We need to engage with the final consumer of information, because and I've seen it a lot. So especially in Southeast Asia, where the rise of media, of the media landscape is relatively new, and all of a sudden they have 50 different printed newspapers, for example, like in Myanmar, for example. This is the kind of thing that the general public is not accustomed to that, and I think we need to invest a lot in educating, to have critical audiences. We need to have also mindful audiences, and it's going to take time, but we need to do it. And I think that again, social sanctions are also good. It's like if you share something that it's fake news, misinformation, well, it should be called out, and it should be also reprehensible in terms of social interactions. I think that's one point that we still need to work in that direction, and I think this could also give us an opportunity not to rely on Twitter or in Facebook to become some sort of a gatekeeper, because I think that, okay, it's welcome that they want to engage in dealing with this issue, but they are for-profit companies, and we need to keep that in mind. I mean, they with this halo of 20th century entrepreneurs, but they are. I mean, they are for-profit organizations. So I think that we need to be careful about giving them all the power in terms of, for example, the last time that I was in a meeting with people from Facebook, they were speaking about trying to address the issue of polarization, and I was like, well, can we define polarization? Because sometimes it can be confused for a vibrant, participative discussion. So, and I'm not comfortable about a private company, creating these kind of standards. That's why I and Article 19 agree in this issue of creating a third independent body that can actually bring all these companies and analyze this kind of issues, setting standards, based on transparency, self-regulation, because they have a lot of power as it is, and I'm not sure that we want them to continue in that way. Now, the issue of media, I think that of corporate media, I agree with you. I think that there is a disconnect, and sometimes it's quite unfair, because sometimes the small media are the ones that are producing the information, and then somebody comes and, especially international media, I've seen it in so many places where, I just interviewed the Chapo, right, in Mexico. Yeah, but there was a lot of work behind that from a lot of news, fixers, a lot of people that are, particularly invisible in this kind of issue. And we need to also understand that. And I think that also independent and professional journalism, it's something that needs to be a part of the current media financial crisis. I think that we need to understand that media, the media is one thing, and the journalism has been part of corporate media, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. I mean, we're seeing, for example, ProPublica, which is a mixture between a think tank and a media. We have other examples in other countries where it is actually working as an NGO, but they are actually producing investigative reports. So I think that the other types of models, and we need to divorce corporate media and the idea that only corporate large media can produce in-depth analysis, because that's not true. And if we start looking into that, we'll see, for example, that community media, it's also important, and the fact that we need to also foster other types of media beside corporate media. And for example, in Argentina, just 3 years ago, they passed a law which, in terms of the division of the spectrum, is now divided between corporate media, community media, which is non-profit media, and universities or public media. And I think it might not be perfect, but at least the fact that we are recognizing that it's not only about corporate media, we can actually move forward into different into a more diverse media landscape that currently doesn't exist. I mean, especially for the indigenous communities, for example, diversity not only in terms of voices, but also in terms of platform, in terms of languages, in terms of resources as well. And I think that that's something that we still need to explore at the global level. But the first step is to realize that there's no such thing as a monopoly of journalism held by the corporate media. There are also people that are doing other things outside that, and we should also foster it and actually celebrate it. Remember when we were all in love with the idea of citizen journalism?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, no, that's unprofessional journalism. And that's we need to come to terms that yes, I mean you can create newsworthy content just by having a cell phone, and that it's okay, and it should be that way, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're a professional journalist or someone just a bystander. You're exercising the same right, which is the right to freedom of expression.
Well, thank you. We can open up for a couple of questions because we're running over time. Question here for the lady.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm a profit and a non-profit organization. Thank you so much for your presentation. Looking at media, we have the United Nations resolutions. So we are lacking some collaboration, coordination, and communication here with the media, the government, which doesn't like the civil society and the media. So how do we bring these people together to make sure they listen to the media? Because civil society, everybody should be involved, as you said, but they are scared. Nobody wants to be a victim of death. So where do we go and what do we do if they cannot listen to the United Nations, especially the overall leaders, the presidents, the governments? So who is the media, and what do the media say that the government doesn't want to hear, and what do the government want to hear from the civil society? So how do we bring this collaboration, coordination, and communication together to save the media and also the victims, who are the people they are reporting about? So what we need to come up with a forum, a summit for head of states, ministers, civil society, and you, the media. And we talk one day, leave alone the United Nations. We come up with a solution, because we'll speak this and the number go up and the number go up. So we are not solving any situation and solution. So we should look at the collaboration, coordination, and communication between the government, the media, and the civil society, and everybody to be included into this fight.
I think coordination and collaboration, that should be the key, and media is part of the civil society, and they've been doing a lot of work to bring this kind of approach of cooperation and partnership. However, it still needs a long way. It's a way forward. Now we're reaching the end of this event. I personally enjoy it. so much. Thank you very much for this really lively discussion and very informative. Please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers. And thank you as well for your active participation. Thanks.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.